What if I told you that 3 innocent nuns, while cleaning out an old church basement in 2012, would uncover a secret so dark and twisted that it would shake the very foundations of their faith? What they discovered about Pastor Michael Harrison, who mysteriously vanished from the small village of Millbrook in 1986, was far more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. This is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about trust, faith, and the darkness that can hide behind the most sacred walls. It was October 15th, 1986, when Pastor Michael Harrison simply vanished into thin air. One moment he was there, delivering his Sunday sermon to the faithful congregation of St. Mary's Church in Millbrook, a quiet village nestled in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. The next moment, he was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, no trace. Just an empty rectory and a community left wondering what could have happened to their beloved spiritual leader. Pastor Harrison wasn't just any ordinary minister. He was the heart and soul of Millbrook, a man who had dedicated 15 years of his life to serving this tight-knit community of barely 800 souls. Everyone knew Michael Harrison. He baptized their children, married their young couples, and comforted them in their darkest hours. He was the kind of pastor who knew every family's story, every struggle, every joy. When someone was sick, Pastor Harrison was the first to arrive with soup and prayers. When times were tough, he opened the church doors to anyone in need. The morning of October 16th started like any other autumn day in Millbrook. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the church secretary for over 20 years, arrived at her usual time of 7:30 to prepare for the day ahead. She expected to find Pastor Harrison in his office, as she had every morning for the past decade and a half, reviewing his notes for the upcoming week's services or counseling sessions. But when she knocked on his office door, there was only silence. "Pastor Harrison?" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty hallway. "Pastor, are you in there?" Still nothing. Eleanor tried the door handle, finding it unlocked, and stepped inside. The office was exactly as it had been the day before, except for one glaring absence: Pastor Harrison himself. His coffee mug sat half empty on his desk, still warm to the touch. His sermon notes for the following Sunday were spread across his desk, his handwriting trailing off mid-sentence as if he had been interrupted while writing. What struck Eleanor as particularly odd was that Pastor Harrison's car was still parked in its usual spot behind the church. His wallet, containing his driver's license and credit cards, was found in his desk drawer. Even more puzzling, his suitcase was still in his bedroom closet at the rectory, and all his clothes remained neatly hung in his wardrobe. It was as if he had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The initial search began immediately. Sheriff Robert Coleman, a man who had known Pastor Harrison since childhood, organized search parties that combed through every inch of Millbrook and the surrounding countryside. Volunteers searched the dense woods that bordered the village, checked abandoned buildings, and questioned every resident. They dragged the small pond behind the church and searched the old mine shafts that dotted the nearby hills. For weeks, the search continued. But Pastor Michael Harrison had seemingly vanished without a trace. The FBI was called in after the local investigation yielded no results. Special Agent Sarah Martinez arrived in Millbrook 3 weeks after the disappearance, bringing with her a team of investigators and the latest forensic technology available in 1986. They interviewed every member of the congregation, examined Pastor Harrison's financial records, and investigated his personal relationships. What they found was a man who appeared to live an exemplary life. No debts, no enemies, no secret vices, and no reason to disappear voluntarily. Agent Martinez discovered that Pastor Harrison had been planning for the future right up until his disappearance. He had scheduled a church renovation meeting for the following month, had made appointments for pastoral counseling sessions weeks in advance, and had even put a deposit down on a new church organ that was to be delivered in December. These were not the actions of a man planning to disappear. As months turned into years, the case of Pastor Michael Harrison's disappearance became one of Pennsylvania's most baffling unsolved mysteries. Theories abounded throughout the small community. Some believed he had been the victim of foul play, perhaps murdered by a drifter passing through town. Others speculated that he had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and wandered into the wilderness, where he had perished from exposure. A few even suggested that he had been living a double life and had chosen to start fresh somewhere else. Though this theory was quickly dismissed by those who knew him best, the impact of Pastor Harrison's disappearance on the community of Millbrook was profound and lasting. The congregation struggled to maintain their faith in the face of such an inexplicable tragedy. Many members left the church entirely, unable to reconcile their belief in a loving God with the mysterious fate that had befallen their spiritual shepherd. Those who remained found it difficult to trust the succession of temporary pastors who came and went over the following years. Mrs. Whitman, the church secretary, was perhaps the most affected by the disappearance. She had worked closely with Pastor Harrison for over a decade and considered him not just her employer, but a dear friend. She blamed herself for not arriving earlier that morning, convinced that if she had been there just an hour sooner, she might have prevented whatever had happened to him. The guilt consumed her, and she eventually left Millbrook entirely, unable to bear the constant reminders of that terrible October morning. The church itself began to deteriorate in the years following Pastor Harrison's disappearance. Without his steady leadership and the declining congregation, maintenance became sporadic, and funding grew scarce. The beautiful stained glass windows that had once filled the sanctuary with colorful light began to crack and fade. The wooden pews, once polished to a warm shine, grew dusty and worn. The basement, which had served as a community meeting space and storage area, was gradually abandoned and forgotten. By 2010, St. Mary's Church was barely hanging on. The congregation had dwindled to fewer than 30 regular attendees, mostly elderly parishioners who had been members since before Pastor Harrison's time. The current pastor, Father David Thompson, was a kind but overwhelmed man who was responsible for 3 different churches in the region. He simply didn't have the time or resources to properly maintain St. Mary's, and the building continued its slow decline. It was in this context that the diocese decided to send a team of nuns to help with the extensive cleaning and reorganization that the church desperately needed. Sister Catherine Murphy, Sister Margaret O'Brien, and Sister Teresa Gonzalez arrived in Millbrook on a crisp morning in March 2012. Armed with cleaning supplies, organizational skills, and a determination to restore St. Mary's to its former glory, Sister Catherine, the leader of the group, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had spent her entire adult life in service to the church. She had overseen similar restoration projects at dozens of churches throughout the state and was known for her ability to transform even the most neglected religious spaces. Sister Margaret, younger and more energetic, brought with her a background in historical preservation and an eye for detail that would prove crucial in the days to come. Sister Teresa, the youngest of the 3, was fluent in multiple languages and had a particular talent for organizing and cataloging church records and artifacts. The 3 nuns began their work in the main sanctuary, carefully cleaning and cataloging everything from hymnals to communion chalices. They worked methodically, room by room, documenting the church's possessions and determining what could be restored, what needed to be replaced, and what should be preserved for historical purposes. Their work was slow but thorough, and after 2 weeks, they had made significant progress in the upper levels of the church. It was Sister Margaret who first suggested that they tackle the basement. "We can't truly say we've restored this church until we've dealt with whatever's down there," she said, gesturing toward the basement door that had remained locked for years. Father Thompson had given them the keys to every room in the church, including the basement, but had warned them that it hadn't been properly cleaned or organized in decades. The basement of St. Mary's Church was a maze of small rooms and storage areas that had accumulated the detritus of decades of church life. There were boxes of old Christmas decorations, stacks of moldering hymnals, broken furniture, and countless other items that had been relegated to storage and forgotten. The air was musty and thick with dust, and the single bare bulb that illuminated the main area cast eerie shadows on the stone walls. Sister Catherine assigned each nun to a different section of the basement. Sister Teresa took the area near the stairs, where most of the recent storage had been placed. Sister Catherine tackled the middle section, which contained what appeared to be furniture and larger items. Sister Margaret was assigned to the far corner of the basement, an area that seemed to contain the oldest items and hadn't been disturbed in years. For the first 2 days, their work proceeded without incident. They filled dozens of garbage bags with items that were beyond salvage and carefully set aside anything that might have historical or sentimental value. Sister Teresa discovered a collection of photographs dating back to the church's founding in 1923. Sister Catherine found several pieces of antique furniture that, with some restoration, could be returned to use in the church. But it was Sister Margaret, working alone in the far corner of the basement, who would make the discovery that would change everything. On the afternoon of March 20th, 2012, Sister Margaret was attempting to move a heavy wooden cabinet that had been pushed against the back wall of the basement. The cabinet was old and solid, and it took considerable effort to shift it even a few inches. As she worked to move it, she noticed that there seemed to be something behind it, not just the wall, but something else. With growing curiosity, she managed to move the cabinet far enough to reveal what appeared to be a small door, painted the same color as the basement walls and nearly invisible in the dim light. The door was only about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. Clearly not meant for regular use. There was no handle, just a small metal latch that had been painted over so many times it was barely visible. Sister Margaret called out to her fellow nuns, her voice echoing through the basement chambers. "Sister Catherine, Sister Teresa, you need to see this." The 3 nuns gathered around the small door, examining it by the light of their flashlights. It was clear that the door hadn't been opened in many years, perhaps decades. The paint around the edges had cracked and sealed, and there were spider webs covering the latch. Sister Catherine, ever practical, wondered aloud what purpose such a small door could serve. Perhaps it's access to some kind of utility area, she suggested, or maybe storage for valuable church items. Sister Teresa, with her background in historical research, was more intrigued by the door's apparent age. "This looks like it might be original to the building," she observed. Churches built in the 1920s sometimes had hidden storage areas for valuable items, especially during the Depression when theft was more common. After some discussion, the 3 nuns decided to open the door. Sister Margaret worked carefully to chip away the layers of paint that had sealed the latch, while Sister Catherine held the flashlight steady. After several minutes of careful work, The latch finally gave way with a rusty squeak that seemed to echo through the entire basement. The door swung open to reveal not a storage closet or utility area, but a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. The tunnel was roughly carved from the stone and earth, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and it sloped downward at a gentle angle. The air that wafted out was stale and carried a strange, unpleasant odor that none of the nuns could immediately identify. Sister Catherine, despite her usual boldness, felt a chill run down her spine as she peered into the tunnel. This wasn't mentioned in any of the church records, she said quietly. Father Thompson never said anything about tunnels under the church. The three nuns stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had discovered. Finally, Sister Margaret spoke up. "We have to explore it," she said. "We can't just close it up and pretend we never found it. What if there's something important down there? What if it's connected to the church's history?" Sister Teresa was more cautious. "What if it's dangerous?" she asked. "These tunnels could be unstable. Or there could be gas or other hazards. Maybe we should contact Father Thompson first. Or even the authorities." But Sister Catherine, after considering both perspectives, sided with Sister Margaret. "We're here to thoroughly clean and catalog this church," she said. "That includes understanding what we've found, but we'll be careful. We'll go slowly. And if we encounter anything dangerous or concerning, we'll stop immediately and call for help." The next morning, the three nuns returned to the basement equipped with better flashlights, rope, and basic safety equipment. They had also informed Father Thompson about their discovery, though they had been vague about the details, simply telling him they had found an old tunnel that might have historical significance. Father Thompson, overwhelmed with his responsibilities at his other churches, had given them permission to investigate as long as they were careful. Sister Margaret, being the smallest and most agile of the three, volunteered to enter the tunnel first. She tied one end of the rope around her waist and gave the other end to Sister Catherine, then began to crawl into the narrow passage. The tunnel was even more cramped than it had appeared from the outside, and she had to move forward on her hands and knees, pushing her flashlight ahead of her. The tunnel extended much further than any of them had expected. Sister Margaret crawled for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only about 50 feet. Before the passage began to widen, the strange odors she had noticed the day before grew stronger as she progressed, and she found herself breathing through her mouth to avoid the unpleasant smell. Finally, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, roughly 8 feet square, and just tall enough for Sister Margaret to stand upright. She played her flashlight around the space, trying to understand what she was seeing. The chamber appeared to be hand-carved from the stone and earth, with rough walls and an uneven floor. But it was what the chamber contained that made Sister Margaret's blood run cold. Along one wall of the chamber were several wooden shelves, and on these shelves were dozens of glass jars and containers. Sister Margaret approached cautiously, her flashlight beam revealing the contents of the jars. What she saw made her stomach lurch and her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped her flashlight. The jars contained what appeared to be preserved human organs and tissue samples: hearts, kidneys, sections of brain tissue, and other body parts floated in a clear preservative solution. Each jar was carefully labeled with dates, initials, and brief descriptions written in a neat, familiar handwriting. Sister Margaret recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same script she had seen in the old church records and sermon notes. It was Pastor Michael Harrison's handwriting. But the jars were not the most horrifying discovery in the chamber. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows. Sister Margaret's flashlight revealed something that made her scream so loudly that Sisters Catherine and Teresa could hear her clearly through 50 feet of tunnel and stone. There, arranged with meticulous care, were human skeletal remains. Not just one skeleton, but parts of several, organized and displayed like specimens in a medical laboratory. Sister Margaret's scream echoed through the tunnel, and within moments, she heard Sister Catherine calling out to her, "Sister Margaret, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" But Sister Margaret found herself unable to respond. She stood frozen in the chamber, her flashlight beam moving from the jars to the bones to a small desk in another corner where she could see notebooks and papers covered with that same familiar handwriting. It took several minutes for Sister Margaret to regain enough composure to call back to her fellow nuns. "Pull me out," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pull me out now. We need to call the police immediately." The extraction from the tunnel seemed to take forever. Sister Margaret crawled backward through the narrow passage, guided by the rope and the voices of her fellow nuns. When she finally emerged into the basement, she was pale and shaking, covered in dirt and barely able to speak. Sister Catherine and Sister Teresa helped her to a chair and gave her water, but it was several minutes before she could explain what she had found. When Sister Margaret finally described the chamber and its contents, the other two nuns initially found it difficult to believe. The idea that Pastor Michael Harrison, the beloved spiritual leader who had disappeared 26 years earlier, could have been involved in something so horrific seemed impossible. But Sister Margaret's obvious distress and the specific details she provided convinced them that she was telling the truth. Sister Catherine immediately called 911, and within an hour, the Millbrook Police Department, the Pennsylvania State Police, and the FBI had descended upon St. Mary's Church. The same Sheriff Coleman who had led the original search for Pastor Harrison in 1986 was now retired. But he was contacted and arrived at the church within hours of the discovery. Agent Sarah Martinez, who had investigated the original disappearance, was also contacted, though she was now retired and living in Florida. The investigation of the hidden chamber was methodical and thorough. Crime scene technicians carefully documented every item in the chamber, photographing and cataloging the jars, the skeletal remains, and the notebooks and papers. The notebooks, written entirely in Pastor Harrison's handwriting, contained detailed records of what could only be described as medical experiments conducted on human subjects. The entries in the notebooks dated back to 1971, just 1 year after Pastor Harrison had arrived in Millbrook. The early entries described his growing fascination with human anatomy and physiology, interests that had apparently begun during his seminary training. But as the entries progressed through the 1970s and into the 1980s, they revealed a man who had gradually descended into a horrific obsession with human experimentation. The notebooks revealed that Pastor Harrison had been using his position of trust and authority in the community to select victims for his experiments. He had targeted individuals who were vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, those with no close family members who might ask questions if they disappeared. The entries described how he would gain access to these individuals under the guise of providing pastoral care, then drug them and transport them to the hidden chamber beneath the church. What Pastor Harrison had done to these victims in the chamber was too horrific for the investigators to fully comprehend. The notebooks described surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, attempts to transplant organs between victims, and experiments designed to test the limits of human endurance and survival. The clinical, detached tone of the entries made them even more chilling. as Pastor Harrison wrote about his victims as if they were laboratory animals rather than human beings. The investigation revealed that Pastor Harrison had been responsible for the disappearances of at least 12 people from Millbrook and the surrounding area between 1971 and 1986. These were individuals whose disappearances had been reported to police but had never been solved. Elderly parishioners who had supposedly moved away to live with distant relatives. Transients who had been passing through town. And even a few members of his own congregation who had simply vanished without explanation. The forensic examination of the skeletal remains in the chamber confirmed that they belonged to multiple individuals of various ages and both sexes. The condition of the bones and the way they had been arranged suggested that Pastor Harrison had kept them as trophies or study materials. Some of the bones showed evidence of surgical modification, supporting the accounts in the notebooks of the horrific experiments that had been conducted. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was the revelation of how Pastor Harrison's own disappearance had occurred. The final entries in his notebooks, dated October 15th, 1986, the day before his disappearance was discovered, revealed that he had become aware that his activities were about to be exposed. A new family had moved to Millbrook, and the husband was a retired police detective who had begun asking questions about some of the unexplained disappearances in the area, rather than face exposure and arrest. Pastor Harrison had decided to disappear permanently, but his method of disappearance was as horrific as everything else he had done. The final notebook entry described his plan to take his own life in the chamber beneath the church, using the same drugs he had used on his victims. He wrote that he wanted to die in the place where he had conducted his life's work, and that he hoped his body would never be found. The investigators' search of the chamber eventually revealed Pastor Harrison's remains in a small alcove that had been hidden behind a false wall. His skeleton was found along with the clothes he had been wearing on the day of his disappearance, as well as a small vial that had contained the poison he had used to end his life. A final note, found clutched in his skeletal hand, contained a detailed confession of his crimes and an expression of his belief that his experiments had been justified in the name of advancing medical knowledge. The discovery of Pastor Harrison's crimes and the revelation of his fate sent shockwaves through the community of Millbrook and beyond. The story made national news, and the small village found itself at the center of a media frenzy as reporters and television crews descended to cover the story. The members of St. Mary's congregation, many of whom had mourned Pastor Harrison's disappearance for 26 years, struggled to come to terms with the reality of who he had really been. The story of Pastor Michael Harrison serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, and that the very institutions we turn to for comfort and guidance can sometimes harbor the darkest secrets. The three nuns who uncovered his crimes had expected to find nothing more than old church supplies and forgotten decorations in that basement. Instead, they discovered a chamber of horrors that had been hidden beneath a house of worship for over 2 decades. Today, the memorial park that stands where St. Mary's Church once stood serves as a quiet reminder of the victims of Pastor Harrison's crimes. A simple stone monument lists the names of those who were identified, along with the inscription, "In memory of those who trusted and were betrayed, may they rest in peace." And may we never forget the importance of vigilance in protecting the innocent. The case remains one of the most shocking examples of how a trusted community leader can hide a double life of unimaginable evil, and how sometimes the most horrific truths can remain hidden for decades, waiting to be discovered by 3 nuns who were simply trying to clean out a church basement.